Elena tugged her suitcase down the narrow dormitory hallway, her footsteps echoing off the faded, scuffed walls. Room 213 stood at the end, a battered brass number hanging askew, as if it had long since given up on being straightened. Elena fumbled with the key, sighing in relief as she stepped into the room she'd be calling home for the rest of the semester. Finally, a space to herself. No more awkward roommates or their incessant chatter. Just peace and quiet. The room was typical of a college dorm. Plain white walls, a twin bed, a worn desk with a flimsy chair, and a small closet barely big enough for her clothes. As she unpacked, she noticed a faint scent lingering in the air. Something floral but old, like dried lavender tucked away in a forgotten drawer. She found it oddly comforting and decided not to dwell on it. After a day of arranging her things, Elena collapsed onto her bed, exhaustion tugging at her eyelids. She drifted off into sleep almost immediately, sinking into the soft embrace of silence. Elena woke up to a soft noise. She blinked into the darkness, disoriented, her mind struggling to catch up with her surroundings. There it was again, soft, rhythmic tapping against the window. Tap, tap, tap. She glanced toward the glass, but all she saw was her own reflection staring back at her, pale and groggy. Her heart thudded in her chest, but she dismissed it as a stray branch brushing against the window in the wind. "Get a grip, Elena," she muttered, rolling over and pulling the blanket over her head. The tapping stopped, and she drifted back to sleep, chalking it up to the restless nerves of sleeping in a new place. The following days passed in a blur of classes, assignments, and settling into her new routine. Elena noticed small things, but dismissed them as the quirks of living alone. Her textbooks would be in different places from where she left them, or the closet door would be cracked open even though she distinctly remembered closing it. It was easy to ignore in the light of day, and she told herself it was just her mind playing tricks. One evening, as she sat at her desk, struggling through a dense reading assignment, she felt a chill sweep through the room. It was strange, unexplainably cold, despite the warmth of the building's heating system. She rubbed her arms, trying to shake off the sensation, when her eyes fell on the window. For the first time, she noticed something etched into the frame. The faint initials AM. She leaned in closer, running her fingers over the jagged lines. The etching felt deliberate, as if someone had pressed hard with something sharp. "Weird," she muttered, but shrugged it off. Probably just a remnant from the last occupant. As she returned to her desk, she didn't notice the small breath of frost that had formed on the glass. It wasn't until the fifth night that Elena heard it, the soft, barely there humming. It was so faint that at first, she thought it was coming from the hallway or maybe from a neighboring room. But as she sat up in bed, straining to hear, she realized it was coming from inside her room. Her heart skipped a beat and she listened intently, trying to catch the tune. It was a simple melody, slow and haunting, like a lullaby whispered in the dark. She switched on her bedside lamp, bathing the room in a warm, comforting glow. But the humming stopped the moment the light came on. Elena scanned the room, half expecting to find someone there. But of course, she was alone. She tried to convince herself that she'd imagined it, that maybe she was just exhausted from studying too late. "Stress," she muttered, shaking her head as she switched off the lamp. "It's just stress." The following day, Elena returned from class to find her bed in complete disarray. Her blankets were twisted, her pillows on the floor, and her clothes, which she had folded neatly in the morning, were now strewn across the room. Her pulse quickened, and she stood frozen in the doorway, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. "Did someone come in here?" she whispered to herself, checking the lock on her door. It was still secure. Her eyes flicked to the window, but it was firmly shut, the latch in place. She gathered her clothes with shaky hands, telling herself she must have forgotten and left them like that. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. That night, as she lay in bed, Elena found herself staring at the mirror on the wall opposite her. Her reflection was clear, the dim light from her desk lamp casting long shadows that twisted and warped across the glass. Just as she was about to turn away, she saw it. A fleeting movement in the mirror. Not her own. Something else. The figure was there for only a second, standing just behind her, pale and barely distinguishable in the dim light. Her breath hitched, and she whipped around, heart hammering in her chest, but the room was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, there was nothing but her own wide-eyed reflection staring back. Elena lay there for hours, eyes fixed on the mirror, unable to sleep, convinced she'd seen something. And that's when she heard it again, the soft humming, drifting through the darkness like a whispered secret. She pulled the blankets up to her chin, eyes glued to the mirror, and whispered, "Who's there?" But only the humming answered, soft and mournful, echoing in the silence. Elena couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over her after that night. The humming, the mirror, the inexplicable cold. It was all starting to feel like more than just stress or paranoia. There was something wrong with this room, something that twisted her insides with unease. Determined to figure out what was happening, she began asking around. During a lunch break, Elena decided to talk to her friend, Maya, who had lived in the dorms for over a year. "Hey, do you know anything about room 213? Elena asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Maya paused, a frown tugging at the corners of her mouth. 213. Yeah, actually. There was a girl who lived there last semester. Alice Moore, I think her name was. But she, left. Left? Elena prompted, her heart quickening. Why? Well, Maya hesitated, lowering her voice. It's kind of a creepy story. They say Alice died in that room. The official report was that it was an accident, but some people say they found her locked inside and no one knows how she got hurt. The police couldn't explain it. And the case just went cold. They never figured out exactly what happened. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. And now, I'm living in that room. Wait, what? Maya looked genuinely startled. Oh my God, Elena. I thought they weren't letting anyone move in there anymore. I heard a rumor that no one lasted more than a week after what happened to Alice. An icy shiver crept over Elena's skin, but she forced a smile. It's probably just a story. You know how these things get exaggerated. But as she walked back to her dorm, her mind raced. Could it be true? Was she living in the room where someone had died? That night, Elena lay in bed, unable to sleep. Every creak of the building, every distant sound made her flinch. She kept her eyes fixed on the mirror, convinced that if she looked away, the figure would return. Hours passed in agonizing silence, and just as she began to relax, the humming started again. This time, it was louder, almost as if it were right next to her ear. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, but the sound persisted, wrapping around her like a blanket of sorrow. Then she heard it, a soft whisper, barely more than a breath. Why won't you help me? Her eyes flew open, and she saw the chair at her desk turning, slowly, as if someone were sitting in it. Her breath caught in her throat, and she could only watch as the chair completed a full circle before stopping, facing her. There was no one there, but the air grew heavy, charged with something unseen. Panicking, Elena grabbed her phone and tried to turn on the flashlight, but the screen flickered erratically, the light sputtering on and off. Why won't you help me? The whisper came again, and this time, Elena was certain it was coming from directly behind her. She spun around, expecting to see someone, something, standing there, but the room remained empty. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she glanced down. A text message had appeared on the screen, but it wasn't from anyone she knew. It read, "Don't leave me." Heart hammering in her chest, Elena scrambled out of bed, rushing to the door. She grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard she twisted, how desperately she pulled, it refused to open. She was trapped. She pounded on the door, screaming for help, but her voice seemed to be swallowed by the room, muffled and distant. The humming grew louder, reverberating in her skull until it was all she could hear. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. The door clicked open, and Elena stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she backed away from the room, the open door swinging shut behind her with a soft thud. The next morning, after barely sleeping a few restless hours, Elena returned to her room, her stomach twisted in knots. She stood in the doorway, half expecting to see Alice's ghost standing there, waiting for her. But the room was quiet, bathed in the morning light. Still, she couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that hung in the air. Determined to find some answers, Elena began searching through the drawers of her desk. They were empty at first, but in the very back of the bottom drawer, her fingers brushed against something soft. She pulled it out, a small, faded journal, with the initials AM etched into the cover. She opened it carefully, flipping through the pages. The entries were mundane at first, filled with notes about classes and friends. But as she neared the end, the tone changed. The handwriting became erratic, the sentences frantic and desperate. I can hear it again. It's humming. It's always humming. No one believes me. They think I'm losing my mind. But it's real. I can feel it watching me. It wants something, but I don't know what. Elena's pulse quickened as she continued reading, her eyes darting over the frantic scribbles. I tried to leave, but it won't let me. The door won't open. The window is locked. I'm trapped. I don't want to die. Please, someone, help me. Her breath caught in her throat, and she stared at the journal in disbelief. The final entry was nothing more than a single word, scrawled over and over again until the ink bled through the page. Why? Elena dropped the journal, her fingers trembling, and took a step back. Her heart pounded in her ears, drowning out everything else, and she could feel the room growing colder, the scent of lavender becoming stronger, suffocating. As she stood there, paralyzed, the air around her seemed to shift. Her eyes flicked to the window, and there, in the faint reflection of the glass, she saw her. Alice. Her face was twisted in pain, eyes wide and pleading, mouth moving silently as if begging Elena to understand. What do you want? Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. Alice's image flickered, growing fainter, and then, in a voice that was both far away and impossibly close, she answered, to leave, but it won't let me. The reflection faded, leaving Elena alone once more, but the cold remained, and as she stared at the journal on the floor, she realized with a sickening certainty that whatever had trapped Alice wasn't finished. Not yet. The journal weighed heavy in Elena's hands, as if it carried the last remnants of Alice's soul. Every page felt like a cry for help, every line etched with the kind of desperation that gnawed at Elena's own sense of reality. She couldn't stay in this room anymore. She wouldn't. Yet something deep inside her whispered that if she didn't help Alice, no one else would. With trembling fingers, Elena flipped back to the journal's final pages, desperate for any clue, any hint of what Alice had faced in her last moments. As her eyes scanned the faded ink, she noticed a line she hadn't seen before, written in shaky letters. It comes from the mirror. Her heart skipped a beat, and she glanced at the mirror on the wall, dread pooling in her stomach. She could almost feel something pulsing within it, an unseen force straining against the glass. The thought of leaving crossed her mind, but it was as if the room had grown smaller, trapping her within its cold embrace. You need to do this, she thought, taking a deep breath. You need to help her. Elena dug through her bag until she found a small candle and a box of matches. Her grandmother had always sworn by candlelight to ward off bad spirits, and right now, Elena needed all the help she could get. She lit the candle and placed it in front of the mirror, the flame flickering wildly as if reacting to some unseen wind. The room's shadows twisted and stretched, and for a moment she thought she saw something moving within the mirror's reflection, something shifting just beyond the glass. Who are you? Elena demanded, her voice shaking. What do you want? The temperature in the room plummeted, and Elena's breath misted in front of her. Slowly, fog began to spread across the mirror's surface, obscuring her reflection until, gradually, another figure took shape. It was Alice, her face pale and translucent, her eyes hollow and dark, as if all the light had been drained from them. She looked directly at Elena, lips moving silently. What are you saying? Elena whispered, stepping closer, the flickering candle casting eerie shadows across her face. Alice's voice came then, faint but clear, cutting through the silence like a blade. It won't let us leave. It's keeping us here. You have to... Her voice cut off, her head snapping toward the door, eyes wide with terror. Elena whipped around, her heart hammering in her chest. There, standing in the dim light of the candle, was a shadow, tall and jagged, its edges shifting as if it were made of smoke. It stretched, twisting and curling, and as it moved closer, Elena felt a crushing weight bear down on her chest. Panic surged through her veins, but her feet refused to move. The shadow stepped forward, and Elena felt an overwhelming wave of dread wash over her. It was as if every fear she'd ever felt, every nightmare she'd ever had, were wrapped up in this darkness, staring back at her through the reflection of the mirror. "No," Elena gasped, forcing herself to step back. "You're not real! You're not real!" The shadow's form shifted, and from within its depths, Elena heard that haunting, melodic humming. It vibrated through the air, vibrating in her bones, in her very soul. The glass of the mirror began to ripple like water, and Alice's reflection twisted, mouth opening in a silent scream. The journal's final entry flashed in Elena's mind. "It comes from the mirror." Desperation gave Elena the strength to act. She grabbed her phone, using the dim glow of the flashlight to illuminate the room, and for a split second, she saw it. The shadow's true form. It wasn't Alice. It had never been Alice. It was something twisted and wrong, all sharp angles and hollow eyes, like a creature that had forgotten how to be human. "Elena." Alice's voice drifted through the room, faint and desperate. "You have to break it. It's the only way." The mirror. It had to be the mirror. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Elena grabbed the chair from her desk and swung it toward the glass. It shattered with a deafening crash, shards raining down around her, the candle flickering wildly as the light seemed to drain from the room. The shadow recoiled, letting out a bone-chilling wail that shook the very walls. Elena staggered back, gasping for air as the fragments of the mirror scattered across the floor. Each shard reflected Alice's face, and for a moment, their eyes met. "Thank you," Alice whispered, her form growing fainter, softer, until she was nothing more than a shadow herself. "You've set me free." The room grew still, and the humming ceased. Elena collapsed to her knees, panting, her heart still racing as she stared at the shattered remains of the mirror. The air felt warmer now, the scent of lavender fading into nothingness. Elena sat there for what felt like hours, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of relief. She'd done it. She'd helped Alice. She was free. But as she reached for one of the larger mirror shards, intending to pick it up, her blood ran cold. Her reflection was wrong. It stared back at her with wide, unblinking eyes, a twisted smile stretching across its face, a smile that did not belong to her. The figure on the other side raised a hand, mimicking her movements, but just as Elena's hand trembled, her reflection stayed perfectly still, the smile growing impossibly wide. "No," Elena whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, no." The reflection's lips moved, mimicking Alice's voice one last time. "You can't leave." And as the door behind her creaked shut, sealing her in, Elena realized that while she might have freed Alice, she hadn't destroyed the shadow. She'd only taken her place. The candle flickered, then went out, leaving her in darkness.